It was already dark when I finally reached the old cabin. The drive had taken longer than I expected, because the road past the lake was barely a road anymore. Mud, loose gravel, and potholes the size of buckets had slowed me down to a crawl. The cabin sat deep in the woods, far from any main road or power lines. The kind of place you wouldn't find unless someone told you exactly where it was. I had rented it online for a weekend alone. I wanted quiet, no phone calls, no city noise, no people. Just me, a notebook, and 2 days to breathe. By the time I parked and turned off the engine, the forest around me was completely silent except for the ticking sound from the hot car engine cooling down. The air smelled wet like old leaves and dirt after a storm. My headlights lit up the front of the cabin. Wood siding faded gray, a small porch, and one single window beside the door. It didn't look like the photos. The listing had shown warm light, clean wood, and a welcoming look. In real life, it looked abandoned. I unloaded my backpack, cooler, and sleeping bag, carrying them all at once because I didn't want to make 2 trips. When I stepped on the porch, the boards flexed and groaned. The door was unlocked, which was strange because I had been told to use a key from under a stone by the steps. I pushed the door open and it creaked loudly, the sound echoing inside like the place hadn't been opened in a while. The smell hit me first. Old wood, dust, and something faintly sour like mildew mixed with rodent smell. I used my phone flashlight and swept the beam across the room. There was one table, a wood stove, a few chairs, and a cot pushed against the far wall. Dust hung in the air, visible in the beam. A few dead flies sat on the windowsill. I dropped my bag and cooler on the floor. I tried the light switch near the door, but nothing happened. I had read in the listing that there was solar power, but maybe it wasn't working. I found a box of candles on the table, half melted and covered in wax strips, and lit one with my lighter. The small flame cast flickering shadows across the cabin walls. There was something heavy about the silence. I didn't hear insects or owls or anything from outside, just wind occasionally moving through the trees. I decided to settle in before it got colder. The stove had a small stack of wood next to it. I checked the chimney flue, found it open, and started a fire. The heat was slow but comforting. The flames crackling was the only sound. After setting up my sleeping bag on the cot, I sat at the table and tried to write in my notebook. But I couldn't focus. I kept glancing at the window, where the darkness outside looked too thick. My own reflection moved faintly in the glass whenever the candle flickered, and every time it made my stomach tighten a bit. I told myself I was just on edge from the drive and the strange quiet. I ate a sandwich from the cooler, drank some water, and decided to step outside for a minute before sleeping. The night air was colder than I expected. I could see my breath when I exhaled. The forest surrounded the clearing in a perfect circle. Tall pines and maples pressed tight together, their black shapes moving slowly in the wind. The moon was hidden behind clouds. I couldn't see more than a few feet past the porch. I stood there listening. Still no insects, no night birds, no rustling animals. Just the sound of trees creaking. It felt wrong. I had been camping enough times to know that forests are never truly quiet at night. Even when animals hide, you can hear something, crickets, frogs, owls, something. This silence felt like everything was holding its breath. After a few minutes, I went back inside and locked the door, sliding the bolt across. I crawled into the sleeping bag, listening to the wind and the faint tapping of branches outside. It took me a long time to fall asleep. When I woke up, it was still dark. For a few seconds, I thought I had only just fallen asleep, but when I checked my watch, it was 2:47 a.m. I wasn't sure what had woken me, but something felt off. The fire in the stove had gone out, and the air inside was freezing. The candle had burned down to a puddle of wax. Then I heard it, a faint sound from outside like gravel shifting under weight. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer or raccoon, but the sound came again. Slow, deliberate crunches like footsteps. I stayed still, barely breathing, trying to listen. The footsteps stopped, then started again, this time closer, moving around the side of the cabin. The window was only a few feet from my cot, and for a second I thought I saw movement behind the glass. Something dark sliding past. I told myself it was just shadows, maybe wind moving branches, maybe a raccoon climbing the side. I reached for my flashlight but knocked it off the crate beside the cot. It hit the floor with a thud that sounded deafening in the silence. The footsteps stopped instantly. I froze. My heart thudded in my chest so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then came a single sound. Soft, slow scraping like something dragging across the outer wall of the cabin. It started near the window, moved down toward the door, then stopped. I lay there for what felt like an hour, staring at the ceiling, waiting for another sound. None came. Eventually, I heard wind again, and I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Maybe a branch had rubbed against the wall. I forced myself to breathe normally. After a while, I fell asleep again. When I woke up, sunlight was coming through the window. The firewood pile looked untouched, and nothing seemed moved inside. I went outside to check. The ground around the cabin was damp from dew, and the mud near the porch had several footprints. I crouched down to look closer. They weren't mine. They were larger. Boot prints, maybe from work boots or hiking boots. The pattern was clear, leading from the trees toward the side of the cabin, then around back and stopping near the door. I felt my stomach twist. Someone had been walking around the cabin last night. I scanned the tree line, but everything looked normal. I told myself it could have been a hunter or hiker passing through. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was had stopped right at the door. I went back inside, made a small fire for warmth, and boiled some instant coffee on the stove. The cabin felt smaller in daylight, every creak of the wood louder. I checked the door. No damage, just dried mud on the step. I tried to distract myself with writing, but every little sound made me flinch. Around noon, I decided to walk down the trail behind the cabin that supposedly led to a stream. I took my backpack, knife, and flashlight just in case. The path was narrow and covered in dead leaves. After about 10 minutes of walking, I started noticing bits of trash. An old can, a torn piece of fabric, a broken bootlace. They looked weathered but not ancient. When I reached the stream, I sat on a rock and listened to the water. The forest there was thick but peaceful. For the first time since arriving, I started to relax. I filled my bottle, rested for a while, then began heading back. Halfway up the trail, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small clearing off to the left with an old rusted trailer half sunk into the dirt. The metal was eaten through with rust, the windows shattered and the door barely hanging on. It looked abandoned for decades. Curiosity made me walk closer. Inside was a mess. Rotted wood, a collapsed bed frame, piles of trash. But there were signs someone had been there more recently. An empty food can with a label that hadn't faded, a newer sleeping bag, and a burned-out fire pit with fresh ashes. I felt that same tightening in my chest again. Whoever had walked around my cabin might have come from here. I didn't stay long. On my way back, I kept looking over my shoulder. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. When I got back to the cabin, it was mid-afternoon. The temperature was dropping fast, clouds rolling in from the west. I decided to start the fire early. As I was stacking logs, I noticed something near the window. Muddy fingerprints smudged on the glass right at eye level. I dropped the log. The prints were fresh. The feeling of being watched turned sharp, almost physical. I walked to the door and checked the lock again. Bolt was still across, but now I noticed faint marks around the edge of the wood. Small scratches, like someone had tried the latch quietly. I backed away and sat on the cot, staring at the door. The wind outside was picking up, branches slapping the roof. I told myself I'd leave first thing in the morning. It was only one more night. The storm started around sunset. Rain hit the windows so hard it sounded like gravel. The fire flickered and I tried to read to distract myself. But the wind kept making strange noises. Low whines through the gaps in the window frames, and once, what sounded like something thumping softly against the wall outside. By 10 p.m., the storm had turned violent. Lightning flashed, followed by deep, rolling thunder that shook the walls. I couldn't tell if I was hearing rain or footsteps on the porch anymore. Every sound blended together. Then during one long roll of thunder, I heard something that froze me completely. The sound of the door handle turning. Slow testing, I stared at it. The bolt trembled slightly as if someone was pressing against the other side. My breathing went shallow. The handle turned again, more firmly this time, then stopped. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, not sure what to do. The storm made it impossible to hear anything clearly. I waited, counting in my head. Then lightning flashed again, bright enough to light the whole cabin for a second. In that flash, I saw something through the window. Just a shape, dark and human-sized, standing a few feet from the glass, unmoving. When the light faded, I couldn't see anything but my own reflect. It was late October when I drove up into the mountains for a few days alone. I had rented an old cabin through a listing that barely had any photos, but it was cheap and remote, and I needed a break from everything. My job, the city, the noise, it had all been wearing me down. I wanted silence. I wanted the kind of quiet that only places far away from people could offer. The road to the cabin twisted endlessly through the woods. The further I went, the less maintained it became. Fallen leaves covered the gravel and the tires kept kicking them up in little brown clouds. The air got colder with every mile and the sunlight was starting to fade behind the tall trees that grew so close together. They almost touched across the road. I didn't see another car the entire drive. By the time I reached the cabin, it was near dusk. The place was small and weathered, sitting in a small clearing surrounded by pine and birch. The wood of the walls was dark and dry and the roof looked uneven. There was a single light bulb on the porch that flickered faintly when I flipped the switch. I carried my bag inside and was hit by that strong wooden, slightly moldy smell that old cabins always have. Inside, it was simple. One main room with a wood stove, a small kitchen area, a narrow hallway leading to a bedroom and a bathroom. The floors creaked badly and every sound echoed like the cabin itself was hollow. I set down my things, opened a few windows to let in some air, and tried to get used to the stillness. The forest outside was dense, so thick I couldn't see more than 30 feet in any direction. When the wind moved through it, it made a strange low sound like the trees were breathing. I remember standing at the window just looking into the darkening woods, realizing how far I was from anything or anyone. No cell service, no nearby houses, no lights on any horizon, just endless forest. That night I made some canned soup on a small gas stove and ate it by the window. It got colder fast and the air inside felt damp. I built a small fire in the stove and soon the crackling was the only sound in the cabin. I felt calm, almost relieved. But as the fire died down and I laid in the small bed, I started to notice noises outside. At first it was small, just the snapping of branches. Then what sounded like footsteps. I told myself it had to be deer or maybe raccoons, but the pacing felt too slow, too deliberate. I listened for a long time, lying perfectly still in the dark, staring at the ceiling. Every time I thought it stopped, another faint crunch of leaves came from outside. Then silence again. I barely slept that night. The next morning, the light coming through the windows looked dull and gray. The ground outside was covered in a thin mist. I walked around the cabin to check the perimeter, telling myself it was just curiosity, but deep down I was looking for signs of something. There were faint impressions in the dirt by the back window, maybe footprints, maybe not, but they looked too large for an animal. They were shallow, not very clear, but I could see where the leaves had been crushed down in two spots side by side. I stared at them for a while, convincing myself they were old. The day was uneventful. I went hiking a bit up a trail that started behind the cabin. It wound uphill through thick woods. There were signs of old logging, stumps, rusted metal parts of equipment half buried in the dirt. I didn't go too far because I didn't bring much water and the trail got hard to follow. When I got back, I noticed how quiet everything was again. No birds, no movement. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. I spent the afternoon stacking firewood and reading a book I'd brought. Around dusk, that uneasy feeling returned. The woods felt alive in the wrong way, like something was paying attention. I brushed it off again. That night, I woke up to the sound of something scraping against the side of the cabin. It was faint at first, like nails dragging slowly across the wooden wall. I froze, listening, every muscle tight. Then I heard it again, long, slow, deliberate. The fire had gone out completely and the room was black. The sound moved from one wall to the next like someone was circling the cabin. My heart was hammering. I didn't move. Then it stopped. I sat there in silence for what felt like an hour before finally getting up and lighting a candle. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn came through the curtains. When I stepped outside, I found something that made my stomach drop. There were fresh marks on the wood, deep, sharp gouges running along the wall just below the windows. Not claw marks, but something else, something made by metal, maybe a knife. That was the moment I started regretting coming there. I decided I would leave the next morning. I didn't want to drive back down that twisting road at night, and I convinced myself it was just some local kids or maybe a hunter who got too close. Still, I couldn't shake the thought of someone walking around out there while I slept. I tried to distract myself by keeping busy. I collected some more firewood, made food early, cleaned up. As the sun went down, I locked every window and door, checked them twice, and sat near the stove with my flashlight close. The silence outside grew so heavy it started to feel like pressure. Every small sound made me tense. When it was fully dark, I thought I heard something again, faint, like a breath or movement outside the door. Then I saw something through the gap in the curtain, a faint reflection like light bouncing off metal. I froze. My hand was gripping the flashlight so tight it hurt. The reflection disappeared. I didn't move for hours. I just sat there waiting. Around midnight, I finally started to drift off in the chair. That's when I heard the front door handle move, just a soft metallic click, then another. Slow, careful. Someone was trying it. I didn't breathe. The door creaked slightly under the pressure, then stopped. I could hear the faint sound of breathing on the other side. Then it was gone. I didn't sleep at all after that. When morning came, I walked outside again, forcing myself to check. The dirt by the porch had clear footprints now. Boots definitely human. The prints led from the trees straight to the steps, then back again. My stomach felt sick. I knew someone had been there, and they knew I was inside. I packed everything quickly. My plan was to leave immediately, but when I went to start the car, the battery was dead. Completely drained. I hadn't left the lights on, and I had driven fine the day before. I checked the hood, but everything looked untouched. That's when I noticed the faint scratches on the driver's side door, thin lines like someone had dragged something sharp along it. I stood there, realizing I was trapped, at least for the time being. There was no cell signal, no nearby houses, and no idea when anyone might drive up that road. I decided I'd wait until someone came by or try walking down to the highway the next morning if nothing changed. That evening, I kept the lights off. I sat in the dark listening. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. I could hear small rustling in the woods every now and then, but nothing close. The hours dragged on. Then sometime after midnight I heard it again. The scraping, but this time it was right under the window. Slow, steady. Then I heard something else. The soft click of the back door latch. I moved quietly to the kitchen and grabbed the only thing I could use as a weapon, a small hatchet I'd brought for splitting wood. I stood there in the dark, listening to my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. The sound moved inside the wall. Not footsteps, but pressure, like someone leaning against the cabin from outside, testing the boards. Then silence again. I didn't sleep. When the sky started to lighten, I opened the door and stepped outside. The grass was wet with dew, and I could see them again. Fresh footprints closer this time. They circled the cabin twice before leading off toward the trees. Whoever it was had come right up to the windows, right up to the doors, and then left again. I decided I wasn't waiting anymore. I packed what I could carry, grabbed the hatchet, and started walking down the dirt road. It was about 8 miles to the main highway, maybe more. The forest was quiet the whole way, too quiet. Every few minutes I looked back, certain I was being followed. I didn't see anything, but I felt it, like eyes on me from the woods. After about an hour, I heard something behind me. Faint footsteps matching mine. When I stopped, they stopped. I turned and scanned the trees. Nothing. The mist was thick again, rolling low over the ground. I started walking faster. My legs burned, my heart raced. The feeling of being watched never went away. Then I saw it. A figure half hidden behind a tree about 50 yards back, tall still facing me. I didn't move. The figure didn't either. For a few seconds we just stood there motionless. Then I blinked and it was gone. I ran until I saw the faint shimmer of asphalt ahead. The highway. Relief hit me so hard I almost fell. I got to the edge and started waving at the first car that came. It was a delivery truck. The driver stopped, confused by the sight of me, dirty, sweating, clutching a hatchet. But he let me climb in the back. When I looked back through the window of the truck as we drove off, I saw the tree line. For a split second, I thought I saw someone standing just inside the woods watching. Then they were gone again. I never went back for the car. I went up to the cabin alone that weekend because I needed quiet. I'd rented it online, an old single-room place near a lake in the woods. The pictures made it look peaceful. Thick pine trees all around, a small porch, and a dirt trail that led to the water. I wanted space to clear my head. I didn't plan anything complicated, just a few days to sit, hike a little, and be away from people. I packed light, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, a camping stove, canned food, some tools, and a small hatchet. The drive up was longer than I thought. The last 20 miles were just dirt road, rough and narrow. Branches brushed the sides of my car as I went deeper in. I didn't pass a single car or cabin on the way. The sun was low when I got there, and the trees had that orange glow that happens just before dark. The cabin was smaller than it looked in the pictures. Gray wood, moss growing around the roof edges, one dirty window. There was a metal lockbox on the door with a key inside, just like the rental email said. I unlocked it and pushed the door open. The smell hit first. Damp wood, old air, and something like burnt dust. Inside was simple. One cot, one table, 2 chairs, a wood stove in the corner, and shelves nailed to the wall. There were old hooks where tools once hung, but most were empty. I checked the floorboards, the corners, the ceiling for spiders, just out of habit. Everything looked fine, just neglected. There were scratch marks on the back of the door like someone had tried to scrape something off years ago. The only light came from a small window above the table. I unpacked my things, lit a lantern, and made some soup. The sound of the stove and the wind outside made the cabin feel small, like the trees pressed in on it. I thought I'd sleep easily after the long drive, but when I lay down, the quiet was too thick. I could hear every creak of the wood and the faint whistling of wind through the gaps in the window frame. Around midnight, I heard a noise outside. Not close, but clear enough, like someone walking through leaves. I told myself it was an animal, probably a deer. I forced myself to stay still and listen. The sound faded after a minute. The next morning, I found boot prints in the dirt behind the cabin. Not mine, they were older, maybe a few days, maybe a week. Still, it made me uneasy. They led from the tree line down toward the lake. I followed them for a bit, then lost them where the ground turned muddy. The water was calm, reflecting the sky. I saw no one else, no other cabins or camps. It was just quiet, heavy quiet. I stayed near the shore a while, trying to convince myself I was just being paranoid. Back at the cabin, I spent most of the day cutting small wood pieces for the stove. It kept my mind busy. As night came, I locked the door from the inside. I sat for a long time just listening. The woods have a way of sounding alive when you sit still long enough. The clicking of bugs, the distant knock of branches, the faint rustle of things moving in the brush. It was all fine until a sound cut through the pattern, different from everything else. It wasn't footsteps this time. It was the sound of wood moving, like something bumping against the cabin wall. Once, then again slower. I froze. The lantern light flickered with the wind sneaking in from the cracks. I stared at the door, then at the window. Nothing moved. I told myself it was a branch. Maybe a branch had fallen or was swaying against the wall. But the sound came again, and it wasn't random. It was a slow, steady drag of something rough against the boards outside, low to the ground near the back wall. I turned off the lantern so the inside was completely dark. I sat there in silence, trying to hear if it was moving around the cabin. I could barely breathe. After a few seconds, it stopped. I didn't move for a long time. When I finally dared to light the lantern again, the silence felt even worse. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I went outside to check. Behind the cabin, near where I'd heard the sound, the dirt was disturbed. There were marks. Long, uneven scrapes leading away toward the trees. I followed them a little way, but lost them where the pine needles thickened. It didn't make sense. It looked like something had been dragged, but not by an animal. I started thinking about leaving, but I told myself I was being stupid. It was probably just a fallen log shifting with the wind. I tried to distract myself by hiking around the area. A few miles out, I found what looked like an old hunter's blind, half collapsed, covered in vines. Inside were a few old cans and a torn backpack. I didn't stay long. I went back before dark. That night I cooked a small meal and tried to stay calm. I even tried reading an old paperback I brought. Around midnight I heard something again. This time it wasn't outside. It came from beneath the floor. A soft, hollow tap like wood bending. I got off the cot and crouched, putting my ear to the boards. The sound came again from right under where I was standing. It stopped when I moved. The floorboards weren't perfectly fitted, so I pried one up with my hatchet. The space underneath wasn't deep, just enough for pipes or storage, but there was nothing there. Just dirt and a few old scraps of wood. I left the board open and sat there waiting, but the sound didn't return. When the sun came up, I stepped outside again. The air felt heavier. The forest looked the same but different, like something about it had shifted. The silence felt forced, like every sound was holding its breath. I checked around the cabin again and found something new near the back corner. A small pile of stones stacked carefully, maybe 7 or 8 high. I hadn't seen them before. I kicked them over, trying to shake off the chill that crept up my neck. I spent the rest of the day packing. I decided I'd leave early the next morning. But as I was putting things away, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. The marks on the door, those old scratches, looked fresher now. The wood around them was lighter, as if scraped recently. I stared at them for a long time. I knew they weren't that clear when I first came. That night was the longest. I kept the lantern burning and my hatchet next to me. Every sound made me flinch. Around 2 a.m., I heard movement outside again, this time closer. I could tell exactly where it was, just beyond the window. Slow, deliberate steps. The boards creaked under my weight as I moved to the wall and stood still. Heart pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. The sound stopped. Then came a faint scrape against the window glass. Not a knock, not a tap, but the slow drag of something dull along the surface. I wanted to move, but I couldn't. The lantern light made it impossible to see outside, only my own reflection in the glass. I turned it off and waited in total darkness. My eyes adjusted, and for a second I thought I saw a shape. Not clear, not detailed, but something tall enough to block part of the tree line. It stayed still for what felt like forever. When I finally blinked, it was gone. I stayed up until dawn, gripping the hatchet. When the first light broke through the window, I stepped outside. The dirt near the wall had footprints again. They were fresh, deep. Whoever it was had been standing there for a while. The stone pile was back too, rebuilt in the same spot I had kicked it over. That was enough for me. I threw everything in my bag, locked the cabin, and got in the car. The road out was rougher than I remembered. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the road. The forest looked endless on both sides. After an hour, I reached the main road. The relief hit so fast it made me dizzy, but as I slowed down at the stop sign near the highway, I noticed something stuck between the windshield wipers, a small flat stone, the same gray color as the ones behind the cabin. I didn't stop to touch it. I just kept driving until I hit the next town. Later, when I returned the key online and left a review, I noticed something strange. The listing for the cabin was gone. Not booked, not unavailable, just deleted. I tried to find it again through the map, but it wasn't there. Weeks passed. I still thought about those nights, about the sound under the floor and the shape by the window. I kept telling myself it was just someone messing around, maybe a local or some old hermit living in the woods. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. The footprints, the stones, the scratches, they were all careful, deliberate. I still have dreams about that night. Sometimes I wake up and think I hear that slow scraping sound again. I tell myself it's nothing, just my mind replaying the fear. But one morning, a few months later, I found something on my porch at home. A small pile of flat gray stones stacked neatly, same as before. That's when I stopped trying to explain any of it. I didn't go back to the woods. I didn't contact the rental site. I just swept the stones into a bag and drove them far away. I dropped them into a river and didn't look back. Still, sometimes at night I swear I can hear something faint in the walls. A soft drag, slow and steady, like something waiting for me to listen again. And every now and then, when I drive past a wooded road or see a cabin tucked deep between trees, I feel that same tightness in my chest, the same silence pressing in, like the woods remember me. It was early October when I drove up to the cabin. I'd been planning the trip for weeks, hoping to get away from everything for a while. Work had been eating me alive and I wanted silence, real silence, the kind you can only get deep in the woods. I rented an old cabin through a website. Nothing fancy, just a small wooden place by a lake surrounded by pine and birch. The pictures made it look peaceful, the kind of place where you could sleep 10 hours a night and still feel rested. The drive took nearly 5 hours from the city. By the time I turned off the main road onto the dirt trail, the sun was already dipping low. The air outside the car smelled clean, sharp with pine and earth. I rolled down the window for a bit, breathing it in. The road wound deeper into the forest, turning from dirt to gravel, then finally to little more than a path. I passed no other cars, no signs of people at all. When I reached the cabin, it was smaller than it had looked online. The wood was darkened with age, the roof covered in moss, the porch half sagging. Still, I didn't mind. It looked quiet. That was all I wanted. There was a small shed to the side of it a few yards away, almost swallowed by tall grass. A rusty padlock hung on its door. The lake stretched out behind the cabin, gray and still with fog sitting low on the surface. I unloaded my stuff, a backpack, some food, and a small cooler. The air had a damp chill to it. The door creaked as I opened it. Inside, the place smelled faintly of mildew and old wood. There was one main room with a small kitchen area, a table, and a wood stove. In the back was a short hallway with 2 doors. One led to the bathroom, the other to the bedroom. I checked everything, just out of habit. The kitchen drawers had mismatched utensils, a few plates, and a can opener. The fridge hummed faintly. The water ran, but it was rusty for a few seconds before clearing. The bedroom had a narrow bed with a thick blanket that looked clean enough. I sat down for a moment and listened. Nothing but the hum of the fridge and the faint ticking of cooling metal from my car outside. That first night was quiet. I cooked something simple, canned soup, and sat on the porch afterward watching the fog roll over the lake. The woods made soft noises, the creak of trees, the faint drip of water, maybe an animal moving somewhere far away. When I went to bed, I felt a strange stillness. It was too quiet, even for the woods. No wind, no crickets, just complete silence. I woke up sometime after midnight. I wasn't sure why at first, but then I heard it. Footsteps on the porch. Slow, steady, and heavy enough to make the old boards creak. I froze. My first thought was that maybe a deer had wandered close, but the steps were too even, too deliberate. They stopped right outside the door. I could hear the faint shift of weight, like someone standing still. I held my breath, waiting for a knock, for anything, but nothing happened. After a while, I convinced myself it had been my imagination, or maybe the wood cooling in the night air. Still, I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, I went out and checked the porch. There were marks on the wood, muddy footprints, faint but clear enough to see. They were human. I followed them a little down the steps and along the side of the cabin, but they disappeared into the damp grass. I told myself someone must have been passing through. Maybe a hiker or a fisherman. Still, it didn't sit right with me. The cabin was miles from the nearest main road. That day, I went exploring around the lake. The fog had lifted, leaving the water dark and still. A few birds moved in the trees. I found an old dock half sunk into the mud, the wood slick with moss. There were empty cans nearby and what looked like the remains of a small campfire, long gone cold. It looked old, weeks or even months old. I stood there for a while, trying to imagine who had been there last. When I got back, I checked the shed. The padlock was still in place, but the door looked slightly off, like it had been pulled on recently. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. The inside looked dark through a small crack in the boards, too dark to see anything. That night it started raining. I sat inside with the small lamp on, reading, listening to the rain hit the roof. The sound was steady, calming. Around midnight, the power went out. I lit a candle, not really worried. It was normal in a place this old. But after a while I heard that same sound again, the creak of the porch boards, the same slow steps one by one. I sat still, the candle flickering. The steps stopped near the window. I didn't look up. I didn't want to. Then there was the faintest sound, something brushing against the wall. It went on for what felt like hours. When it finally stopped, I stood and went to the window, my heart pounding. I lifted the corner of the curtain just enough to look out. The rain was still falling, but I saw movement near the trees. Someone walking away slowly, disappearing into the dark. I locked the door again, even though I already had. Then I moved one of the chairs under the handle. I didn't sleep at all that night. In the morning I found more footprints, this time clearer. They went around the cabin in a full circle close to the walls. I saw where they had stopped beneath each window. I don't know how long whoever it was had been standing there, watching. I thought about leaving, but part of me wanted to believe it was harmless. Maybe some drifter, maybe even a local who didn't like outsiders. I decided to stay one more night just to see. I told myself I'd leave if anything else happened. That evening I went to the car and made sure it was ready to go. I packed some things in case I needed to leave fast. The rain had stopped, but the air was colder now. The woods felt different. Every sound made me tense. I cooked again and sat at the table, staring at the window. As it got darker, I noticed something odd. Every time I looked away, I thought I saw movement outside. Small flashes of shape between the trees. When I looked directly, there was nothing. Around 11 p.m., I heard it again. The steps. This time they didn't stop at the porch. They came around the side of the cabin, slow and dragging. I could hear the faint crunch of leaves, the soft brush of something against the wood. Then, out of nowhere, there was a dull thud, like someone hitting the wall with their hand. I froze. The thuds came again, spaced apart, almost like knocks. Then silence. I stood there for what felt like forever. My hand was on the chair under the door handle. The silence dragged on so long that I started to think maybe it was over. Then came a sound from the back of the cabin, a faint metallic clank. I knew immediately where it came from. The shed. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped to the window, but when I shined it toward the shed, the beam barely reached. I could see the outline of it in the dark, the padlock still hanging from the door. But the door itself, it was open just a few inches. Something moved inside. Not fast, not loud, but enough for me to see it, something shifting like a person crouched low. I backed away and locked every door again, even though it wouldn't matter much if someone really wanted in. The night stretched on. Every small sound made me jump. I must have dozed off near dawn because when I woke, the candle had burned out and faint light was coming through the windows. I went straight to the shed. The door was open wider now. Inside it was empty except for a few broken tools and an old tarp. The ground was damp, covered in footprints, fresh ones. They led out of the shed, around to the back of the cabin and stopped at the window of the bedroom. That was the moment I knew I had to leave. I packed my bag as fast as I could. As I was loading it into the car, I saw something caught under the porch, a piece of torn fabric, maybe from a jacket. I pulled it out. It was dark with dried mud and what looked like old blood. I didn't think. I got in the car and started driving. The road back felt longer this time, the woods pressing close on both sides. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station nearly an hour away. When I got out, my legs were shaking. I went inside to get coffee, and as I stood there, the guy behind the counter asked if I was coming from up near the lake. I nodded, not really wanting to talk, but he went on. He said someone had broken into a few cabins around there the past month. A drifter, maybe. They hadn't caught him yet. The police had found one of the cabins with blood inside, a bed torn up, and signs that someone had been living in the walls or under the floor. I didn't say anything. I just left, driving until the trees were nothing but a blur in the rearview mirror. I never went back to that cabin. A few weeks later, I looked it up online again, out of curiosity. The listing was gone. I don't know if they took it down or if someone else rented it, but sometimes when I think about that night, I remember how quiet it was right before the footsteps started. How someone could stand so close right on the other side of the wall and not make a sound until they wanted you to know they were there, and I still wonder how long that person had been around the cabin before I ever heard them at all. Maybe the first night I thought I was alone. I wasn't. Maybe they'd already been watching, waiting for me to fall asleep. Every so often, when it rains and the house settles at night, I think I hear it again. That slow, dragging step across old wood. Only now it's harder to tell if it's just in my head. Because once you've heard that sound in the dark, once you've known someone was right outside your wall, that kind of silence never feels safe again. It was late September when I decided to drive out to the old cabin my uncle left behind years ago. He used to hunt there every winter until he got too sick to go. I'd only been there once as a kid, but I still remembered the long dirt road that wound through endless trees, the smell of pine thick in the air, and how the forest seemed to swallow every bit of light once the sun went down. I'd been working long hours in the city, barely sleeping, barely eating, feeling like I was running on fumes. The cabin felt like the only place I could clear my head. Quiet, away from everything. That's what I told myself anyway. The road started as a smooth stretch of asphalt but turned to gravel, then to packed dirt. Every few miles the forest grew thicker, pressing closer to the sides of the truck like it wanted to pull me in. My phone lost signal about 40 minutes in. After another half hour, I reached the clearing. The cabin sat alone, hunched in, the middle of tall grass and thin birch trees. Its roof dark with moss and corners eaten by time. The air smelled damp, heavy, like rain was coming. The silence out there was strange, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Inside, it was colder than outside. The wooden floor creaked under my boots, the air stale and sharp with dust. There were still old hunting trophies on the walls, a deer head, a few antlers, yellowed maps pinned beside them. The table in the corner was still set with old metal cups, a rusted lantern, and a half-broken radio. I dropped my bag near the bed, the mattress sagging in the middle. The sheets were still there, stiff with age. The place hadn't changed much at all. I spent the first few hours sweeping dust off the shelves, clearing out cobwebs, trying to make it feel livable. The quiet was strange. No cars, no voices, not even birds for a while. Just the occasional snap of a branch outside, the whisper of wind through the trees. By late evening, clouds had gathered overhead, and the sky turned gray. The forest started to darken, slowly swallowing the last bit of daylight. I started a small fire in the stove, made some canned soup, and sat by the window eating while watching the trees move in the wind. That's when I noticed something odd. There was a faint path behind the cabin I hadn't seen before, half covered by fallen leaves and weeds. It wasn't on the old map nailed to the wall either. It led downhill into thicker woods where the light barely reached. It looked like no one had walked it in years. I figured maybe my uncle had used it once, or maybe it was a game trail. I told myself I'd check it out in the morning, though I already felt uneasy about it. The rain started late that night. Slow at first, then harder, hitting the roof like a drum. The wind rattled the windows and pushed smoke back into the room from the old stove. I turned off the lantern and lay in bed listening to the rain. The wood creaked every now and then, expanding and settling. I tried to sleep, but something about the noise outside kept me awake. The storm made the forest sound alive. Branches bending, leaves slapping against the windows, something shifting through the wet grass outside. At one point, around 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard a deep thud near the back wall. Not like a branch falling, heavier, slower. Then nothing. Just rain. My heartbeat picked up. I stayed still, listening. After a few minutes, another sound, like a dragging scrape, faint, moving along the side of the cabin. I sat up, staring toward the dark corner of the room, waiting for it again. The noise stopped. I told myself it was the storm, maybe a fallen branch sliding off the roof, maybe an animal trying to get out of the rain. I forced myself to lie back down. Eventually, I drifted off. The next morning was foggy and still. Everything outside was soaked, the ground slick with mud. The air smelled like wet pine and earth. I went around the cabin to check for damage. On the far side, near the back window, the mud was disturbed, not just by rain, but by footprints. Bare footprints. Small, human-looking. They led toward the path I'd seen last evening. I crouched to get a closer look, touching the mud with my fingers. They were fresh. The rain had stopped maybe a few hours ago, but the edges of the prints were sharp, not washed out. I felt something tighten in my chest. I stood there for a long time just staring at the trail. It disappeared quickly into the trees. I thought about following it, but decided to wait until later. I didn't like the idea of wandering into the woods alone while the ground was slick and visibility low. I told myself maybe some local kids had found their way here, or someone was camping nearby. Still, I kept checking behind me as I gathered some wood for the fire. By noon, the fog lifted, and the forest turned calm again. I packed a flashlight, a pocket knife, and a bottle of water, then walked toward the path. The air got colder the deeper I went. The ground was uneven, roots sticking out like ropes, the silence thick. After maybe 10 minutes of walking, I found something that stopped me. A piece of torn fabric stuck on a branch, faded red, maybe from a shirt. A few steps later, another print in the mud, this time larger, deeper. Not bare, it looked like a boot. The path wound down toward a small stream. The water was murky from the rain. Across it, I saw what looked like an old structure, maybe another cabin or shed, hidden behind the trees. The roof had collapsed and moss covered the sides. I crossed the stream, slipping once on the rocks. The structure looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The door hung half off its hinges, and the smell coming from inside was sharp and sour like rot. Inside were the remains of what looked like old hunting gear, broken traps, rusted cans, torn blankets. In the corner there was something that made my stomach twist. A pile of bones, small ones, scattered beside an old shovel. Animal bones, maybe. I hoped they were. But they were arranged strangely, like someone had stacked them intentionally. I backed out slowly, every sound suddenly louder. My breathing, the crunch of leaves, the distant creak of trees in the wind. I felt like I was being watched. I started back up the trail faster than I came, glancing behind me every few seconds. The forest seemed darker now, heavier. By the time I reached the cabin again, the light was already fading. I locked the door and pushed a chair under the handle, even though I knew it wouldn't do much if someone really wanted to get in. I sat by the window watching the tree line, every rustle of leaves making my nerves tighten. Night came quick, and with it, the rain again, softer this time, but steady. I lit the lantern, and its glow barely reached the walls. Around midnight, I heard footsteps again. Slow, careful circling the cabin. My chest tightened so hard it hurt, I didn't move. The sound stopped, then started again near the back window. That same dragging sound from the night before. I reached for the knife on the table, my hand shaking. Then silence. Long, empty silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. When daylight came, I went outside again. The footprints were there. 2 sets this time. One bare, one with boots. They led away toward the woods but stopped halfway down the path, like whoever it was had stood there watching. I thought about leaving right then, packing my stuff and driving out. But part of me, maybe pride, maybe stupidity, wanted to understand who or what was out there. I told myself I'd stay one more night. I spent most of that day chopping wood, keeping myself busy, anything to avoid thinking too much. But I couldn't stop checking the tree line. The forest felt different, quieter, heavier. Around evening, I noticed something new. A smell in the air, faint but clear, like smoke, but not from my fire. It came from the direction of the old path. I followed it a short way, careful to stay quiet. The smell grew stronger. Burning wood, maybe something else mixed in. Through the trees, I saw a flicker of orange light. I crouched low, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. The light came from a small fire near the old shed, and beside it, someone was sitting. A figure hunched forward, motionless. I couldn't make out details from that distance, just the outline. I didn't move. I just watched. The figure stayed there, staring into the fire. Minutes passed. Then slowly their head turned toward me. I froze. Even from that distance, I knew they'd seen me. They stood up, slowly, their movements stiff. I turned and walked back, trying not to run. But I could hear them. Faint steps following, matching mine. When I reached the clearing near my cabin, I looked back. Nothing. The woods were still. That night I didn't light a fire. I sat in the dark, listening. Hours passed, and then the sound came again. Faint, steady, moving around the cabin. A scrape against the wall. A soft thud near the door. I gripped the knife tighter, my hands slick with sweat. Then silence again. It went on like that until dawn. When the first light hit, I opened the door. The footprints were there again, leading to the window this time, closer than before. The mud showed where someone had stood for a long time just outside, watching. That was it for me. I packed everything, didn't even bother to clean up. As I started the truck, I looked at the tree line one last time. The forest looked the same, quiet, still. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was standing just out of sight, watching me go. I didn't stop driving until I reached the main road, my hands locked tight on the wheel. Later, when I told the local sheriff about it, he said there hadn't been anyone living out there in years. The nearest house was miles away. He mentioned some hikers had gone missing near that area a few times over the years, but no one ever found anything. I didn't say much, just nodded and left. I never went back. I remember that weekend like it's burned into the back of my head. I'd taken a long drive up into the northern hills, just outside a small logging town that barely had a gas station and a diner. I rented an old cabin that used to belong to some forest ranger decades ago. It was supposed to be quiet, peaceful, just me, the woods, and a few days to think. I brought some food, a few tools, and a small generator in case the power went out. I didn't expect it to feel so detached from everything the moment I pulled off the dirt road and saw it sitting there, half hidden behind the trees. The cabin wasn't big, just a single story with a slanted roof and a porch that creaked when the wind moved through it. The paint had peeled so much it looked like the wood was shedding its own skin. When I stepped inside, the smell hit first. Old wood, damp air, and a faint trace of burned oil. The windows were dusty, the floorboards uneven, and the air carried that silence that only deep woods have, where even the smallest sound seems loud. There was no phone service out there, no Wi-Fi, just the sound of wind dragging through the trees. I liked that at first. I told myself I needed that kind of quiet. But by the second evening, that same silence felt heavier, almost like the woods were pressing against the walls, listening. The first night, nothing strange happened. I cooked a simple meal on the small gas stove, sat near the window, and watched the tree line disappear into darkness. The forest there wasn't like the kind you hike through. It was dense, overgrown, with trunks packed so close that light barely reached the floor during the day. At night it turned black, like a wall. I remember sitting there, realizing how dark real darkness could get when there's no town, no headlights, no sky glow. Nothing. Just pitch black. Sometime past midnight I woke up without knowing why. It wasn't a sound exactly. More like something in the air had shifted. The generator was still humming faintly outside, and I could hear the wind moving slow through the trees. I lay there staring at the ceiling, waiting for a reason to get up. That's when I heard the faintest crunch outside, like footsteps, slow and heavy, moving along the gravel near the porch. I told myself it was an animal. maybe a deer or a raccoon. The woods were full of them. Still, something about the rhythm of those steps didn't sound right. They weren't light or quick. They paused, moved, paused again. I didn't move. I just listened. Eventually, they faded away toward the trees. I stayed awake for almost an hour after that, waiting for another sound. But the night went dead silent again, and eventually I must have fallen back asleep. The next morning, I stepped outside. The air was sharp and cold, and the ground was damp from the night dew. I looked around the side of the cabin where I'd heard the noise. The gravel had marks like footprints, but not clear ones. The ground was uneven. Some prints were deeper than others, shaped roughly like boots. I stood there for a while, staring at them. Then I convinced myself they must have been mine from when I'd unloaded the car the day before. The second night felt longer. The generator kept flickering, the lights dimming every now and then. I noticed that when the light flickered, the sounds outside seemed to shift too. Every few minutes I'd hear something faint, a branch cracking or what sounded like a shovel scraping dirt. I told myself the woods were just full of random noises, the kind you only notice when everything else is quiet. But what got to me most was the feeling that the cabin wasn't empty when I was inside it. Every time I sat down, I'd catch myself glancing toward the windows. I kept expecting to see something behind the glass. Not a face, just movement. A darker shape against the dark. By the third day, the food I'd brought was already going bad because the small fridge barely worked. I spent most of the afternoon fixing one of the shutters that had come loose. While hammering it back in, I noticed a trail behind the cabin that I hadn't seen before. Just a thin path half hidden by weeds, leading deeper into the trees. It didn't look like an animal trail. It was too straight, too deliberate. I followed it for a while, maybe 50 or 60 yards, before it opened into a small clearing. The ground there looked disturbed. Patches of dirt had been dug up and filled again. There were pieces of old wood, maybe part of a fence or an old shed, broken and buried halfway. I stood there feeling like I shouldn't be there. The air was still, no wind, no sound, nothing. I turned back and made my way quickly to the cabin. That night I barely slept. The generator had run out of fuel and I didn't bother refilling it. I sat by the window with a flashlight listening. The air outside was damp again, and I could hear the slow drip of rain starting somewhere in the forest. Around midnight I heard it again, the footsteps. But this time they were closer. They came from behind the cabin, slow and careful, moving along the wall. I could hear them through the wood, thud, pause, thud. I held my breath and turned off the flashlight. My eyes adjusted to the dim light from the window, and I could barely make out the edge of the porch through the glass. The footsteps stopped. For a long time there was nothing. Then a faint scrape like metal against wood near the back door. I froze. I didn't have a weapon, just a hammer and a small knife from the kitchen. I waited, counting each second, my chest tight. The sound came again, a slow drag, then silence. I sat there for what felt like hours until I saw the first trace of morning light. When I stepped outside later, I found fresh mud smeared near the back door and a faint indentation on the wooden step, as if someone had been standing there. The marks led off toward the same trail I'd seen the day before. I packed my stuff that morning, but when I tried to start the car, it wouldn't turn over. The battery was dead, completely drained. It had been working fine the day before. I popped the hood, checked everything, but I wasn't a mechanic. The road to town was miles away. My phone still had no signal. I told myself I'd walk out in the morning. There was still daylight, and I didn't want to get lost in the forest if the sun went down. I spent the day inside, keeping the door locked. I didn't do much, just listened to the forest, every creak of the cabin making me flinch. The quiet felt different now. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt like something was waiting for me to step outside. That night was the worst. The rain came hard, hammering against the roof and windows. The wind howled through the trees, making the cabin shudder. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, staring at the door, holding the hammer tight in my hand. Then, in the middle of the storm, I heard it again. Not footsteps this time, something heavier, dragging through the wet dirt just outside. The porch creaked. The door handle moved just slightly, enough to make it click. I felt my whole body go still. The handle moved again, slower this time, and then stopped. For a long time, the only sound was the rain. Then, one hard knock on the door. Just once, I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The knock didn't come again. Eventually, the rain eased and the sound faded into the distance. I sat there until morning. When the sun came up, I opened the door. The ground outside was torn up, muddy footprints, deep and uneven, leading from the porch toward the trail. I followed them with my eyes until they disappeared into the trees. That was when I saw it. Something small sticking out of the mud right at the edge of the clearing. It was a piece of metal, maybe a few inches long. When I picked it up, I realized it was a broken blade from a shovel. The edge was bent, rusted, but recently used. I didn't wait around. I took what I could carry and started walking the dirt road out of there. It took me most of the day to reach the main highway, and when I finally got signal again, I called a tow truck. A few days later, after I got home, I looked up that area online. Turns out the land around that cabin used to belong to a logging company that shut down after a worker went missing there years ago. They never found him. Just his tools scattered around the woods. I don't know what was out there those nights, who or what walked around that cabin. But I still think about that trail, those dug-up patches of dirt and the knock on the door that didn't come again. Sometimes, when it rains late at night, I swear I can still hear that faint, slow drag of footsteps in the mud. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. I'd been working long hours in the city, stuck in a routine that was draining me day by day. My friend had told me about a small cabin he once rented deep in the northern woods. No neighbors for miles, no phone signal, no traffic. Nothing but the sound of trees and wind. That's exactly what I needed. I booked it for 4 days. Packed food, a flashlight, my camera, some clothes, and a few basic tools just in case. I didn't plan on doing much. Maybe hiking a little, reading, and sleeping without the sound of cars passing outside my window. The drive there was longer than I expected. Once I left the main highway, the paved road turned into a long dirt path full of potholes and mud patches. It had rained earlier that morning and the trees looked darker, the air thicker. The deeper I drove, the narrower the path became, the branches brushing against both sides of my car. My GPS lost signal after a few turns, but I had printed directions. The last stretch was a one-lane trail leading up a small hill surrounded by dense pine trees. When I finally saw the cabin, it felt like stepping out of the world. It was small, maybe 2 rooms total. The wood on the walls looked old but sturdy. The windows had thick frames, the kind you could tell hadn't been opened in years. There was a small porch with a single rocking chair. Behind the cabin, I could hear a faint stream, hidden somewhere in the trees. It was quiet, so quiet that when I turned off the engine, the silence pressed against me. Inside, it smelled of old wood and dust. The air was cool and still. There was one bedroom, a tiny kitchen with a wood-burning stove, and a main room with a small couch, a table, and a fireplace. A few cobwebs hung from the corners, and the floor creaked under every step. There was no electricity, just a few lanterns and candles left on a shelf. It didn't bother me. I actually liked it that way. It felt cut off, like the world couldn't reach me here. I unpacked, set my things neatly on the table, and started a small fire in the fireplace. The wood hissed and popped, and for a while it felt perfect. I made some instant coffee, sat near the window, and watched the forest. The trees barely moved. Even the air felt heavy. That first night I fell asleep early. The sound of the fire and the faint wind outside lulled me into sleep fast. But at some point in the night I woke up. It wasn't because of a noise. It was the lack of one. The fire had died down and the cabin was pitch black. I could only hear my own breathing. I lay still, staring into the dark, listening. For a while nothing moved. Then somewhere outside I heard a faint thud. It was distant but real, like someone had dropped something heavy on the ground. I sat up slowly, waiting, but the sound didn't come again. I told myself it was probably just a branch falling. Still, I couldn't fall back asleep for hours. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something faint. Maybe footsteps on the leaves, maybe an animal. But nothing came to the door. In the morning, the forest looked calm again. Sunlight came through the trees, soft and warm. I made breakfast and decided to walk around the area. The air smelled of wet pine and the ground was soft with mud. After a few minutes, I reached the small stream behind the cabin. The water was clear and cold, running over rocks covered in green moss. I followed it for a while and saw no sign of anyone. No footprints, no trash, no signs of other people being here. It was just endless trees. By the second night, I had gotten used to the isolation. I sat outside after sunset, listening to the stream and the wind. The sky was full of stars, more than I'd seen in years. The quietness was comforting at first, then strange, almost too complete. When I finally went inside and locked the door, I noticed something odd. On the window ledge outside, there were small marks, like someone had set something heavy there. I hadn't seen them before. They looked fresh, clean cuts in the dust. I brushed it off.
Maybe an animal jumped up there.
Maybe a raccoon. But when I woke up that night again, it wasn't the same as before. This time I heard something clearly. Footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy, deliberate steps. They stopped near the door. I didn't move. My heart was beating so loud it felt like the only sound in the room. I sat there in the dark, waiting, barely breathing. Then I heard the soft creak of the wooden chair outside. The rocking chair. It moved once, twice, then stopped. The air in the room felt colder. I stayed still for almost an hour before I dared to get up and check the window. When I finally looked, the chair was still unmoving. The porch was empty. I told myself maybe it was the wind, but deep down I knew no wind had pushed that heavy chair like that. The next morning I checked outside. There were footprints, not clear ones, but pressed marks in the damp wood of the porch. Human-shaped, light but fresh. I felt a chill run through me. Someone had been there. I looked around the trees, but the forest was quiet again, pretending nothing happened. That day I stayed close to the cabin. I gathered some firewood, checked the car, and tried to distract myself by reading. But my focus was gone. Every sound made me glance up. Every crack from the trees made me freeze. By the third night, I decided to keep a lantern burning inside. I didn't want to sit in the dark again. I double-checked the locks, made sure the windows were closed tight, and sat near the fire. The night went on quietly at first. Then around midnight, I heard something again. Not from the porch this time, but from the side of the cabin. A soft scraping sound, like something being dragged along the wall. Then a dull knock. Slow, repeated. It moved, from one side of the cabin to the other. I turned off the lantern and listened. The knocking stopped. The forest outside went silent again. I stood there in the dark for a long time before going back to bed. But sleep didn't come easy. In the morning, I saw what made that sound. On the back wall of the cabin near the window were marks. Long, uneven scratches in the wood. Not deep, but enough to notice. It didn't look like an animal's claws. It looked like something metal had been dragged along it. I felt something shift inside me then. That slow realization that maybe I wasn't alone out here. Maybe someone else had been coming at night watching. The woods were large enough for anyone to hide in. I considered leaving that day, but it was early afternoon and the drive back was long and rough. I decided I'd leave the next morning as soon as it was light. I packed most of my things that night and kept my flashlight near me. I didn't sleep. Around 2 a.m. I heard it again. The same footsteps, but closer, slower, circling the cabin. Then silence. Then the sound of breathing. Not loud, not close, but enough for me to hear through the wall. Just steady breathing outside. My skin went cold. I didn't move for over an hour. Eventually, the sound faded away. When morning finally came, I stepped outside and saw more footprints in the mud. Clearer this time. Barefoot. The ground was cold and wet, yet the prints were clean. Whoever it was had walked silently through the woods at night without shoes, coming right up to my window. I threw everything in the car and left. The tires slipped in the mud and I nearly hit a tree backing out, but I didn't care. The road felt endless, every turn looking the same. When I finally reached the paved road, I pulled over just to breathe. My hands were shaking. I never went back to that cabin. I called the rental company a few days later just to report what I'd seen. They said no one else had rented that place in months. They sounded surprised anyone would go that deep alone. For weeks after that, I couldn't sleep right. Every small sound at night made me tense. I checked my doors 3 times before bed. It wasn't fear of ghosts or anything supernatural. It was the thought that someone could be out there, watching, waiting, hidden just beyond the edge of the trees. A few months later, I read a short news article about a missing hiker found near that same forest. It didn't say much, just that his camp was found abandoned, his belongings scattered, no signs of struggle. The area was the same region as that cabin. I didn't read further. Sometimes when I think back to that night, I remember how quiet the woods were, how heavy that silence felt before I heard the footsteps. That's what stays with me. That silence wasn't empty.
It felt like it was waiting, and I know deep down
That whatever was there that night is still out there, walking barefoot through the trees, waiting for the next person to come looking for peace and quiet where they shouldn't. It was late October when I decided to take a short trip to the mountains. I'd been feeling worn out from work, the noise of the city and the constant rush that came with it. I wanted a place where no one could reach me. No phones, no people, just silence. I rented a small wooden cabin near an old hiking trail deep in the forest, miles from the nearest town. The pictures online showed it as a simple, quiet place. Wooden walls, a small deck, a metal chimney, and a view of the endless trees that stretched far beyond. It looked perfect. The road to the cabin was rough. After an hour of driving uphill, my phone signal disappeared completely. The gravel road twisted through thick woods, and every turn looked the same. Tall pine trees on both sides, dry leaves scattered across the path, and the smell of damp soil in the air. It was already getting dark when I finally saw the cabin. It was smaller than I expected, but it had a strange charm. The roof slanted sharply, covered with brown leaves, and the wood looked old but sturdy. A small porch light flickered weakly near the door. When I stepped out of the car, the air hit me, cold, sharp, and clean. There was complete silence except for the soft rustling of trees in the wind. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like old wood and dust. The floor creaked under my boots. There was one small room with a bed pushed against the wall, a table with 2 chairs, a shelf full of random things, old books, a lantern, and a small radio. The kitchen area was simple. A rusty sink, a stove that looked like it hadn't been used in years, and a small fridge that hummed quietly. I unpacked slowly, setting my bag on the bed. The walls were thin. I could hear the faint whistling of wind outside. There was no internet, no phone signal, and only one power outlet that barely worked. I didn't mind. That was the point of coming here. I made some coffee on the stove, sat by the window, and watched the forest. As the sky turned dark, the forest became a black mass of movement. The wind grew stronger and the branches scraped against the roof. That first night was calm but restless. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the noises outside. The cabin made its own sounds, the creaking of wood, the faint tapping on the window, and the steady hum of the fridge. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why. The sound that woke me wasn't loud. It was faint, like a slow dragging sound coming from outside just below the window. I stayed still, holding my breath, listening. The dragging sound stopped, then came again, softer this time, like something being pulled through the dirt. I waited for it to stop, but it went on for a few more seconds and then faded into the wind. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably an animal. The forest was full of them, deer, foxes, maybe even a bear. But something about that sound didn't feel right. It wasn't the movement of an animal. It was too slow, too deliberate, like something heavy being moved by hand. I stayed awake for another hour before I finally drifted off again. The next morning I stepped outside to look around. The ground near the window had marks, long, shallow lines in the dirt like something had been dragged along. It could have been fallen branches, I told myself. But I didn't see any branches nearby. The air was colder that day, and the clouds hung low, gray and heavy. I decided to walk down the trail a bit, just to get familiar with the area. The forest felt endless. The trail wound between thick pines and fallen logs. Every few minutes I'd hear rustling somewhere off the path. But whenever I stopped to listen, everything went still. The deeper I went, the darker it got. The trees blocked most of the sunlight, and the air felt damp and heavy. I found an old wooden sign along the trail, almost buried under moss. The letters were barely visible, but I could make out the word keep. The rest was too faded to read. It didn't look like a warning sign, just something old and forgotten. After an hour, I turned back. When I got near the cabin, I noticed something strange. One of my cabin windows was open. I was sure I had closed all of them before leaving. The window above the sink was slightly pushed open, and the curtain inside was fluttering in the wind. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, trying to think logically. Maybe the wind pushed it open, or maybe it wasn't locked properly. Still, I felt a weight in my chest. Inside, nothing seemed out of place. I checked my bag, my wallet, my keys, and everything was where I left it. I closed the window tightly and tried not to think too much about it. The day went by slowly. I read one of the old books from the shelf, made some food, and tried to relax. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, the wind picked up again. The forest outside roared like the ocean. The cabin creaked constantly, the wood straining against the cold. I tried to sleep, but around 1 a.m. I heard that same dragging sound again, closer this time, right outside the cabin wall. It was followed by a faint metallic clink, like something tapping against stone or metal. My chest tightened. I sat up, trying to listen through the noise of the wind. The dragging stopped, but the clinking continued. Slow, irregular, as if someone were scraping metal across the ground. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe for a moment. Then silence. No dragging, no wind, nothing. I waited a long time before lying back down. My mind was racing. I didn't know if it was an animal, a person, or just my imagination. But the next morning, when I stepped outside again, I saw footprints. Not animal prints, but boots. The ground was soft from the rain last night, and near the edge of the cabin, I could clearly see 2 deep impressions leading into the trees. I followed them a short distance until they vanished into the undergrowth. They weren't mine. I hadn't been out since the day before, and these prints looked fresh. I felt that same cold weight in my stomach. Someone had been here. The rest of the day I stayed inside. Every sound outside made me tense. I kept checking the windows, the door, the trees. I told myself it could have been a hiker or a hunter passing by, but the idea didn't convince me. The prints led straight to my cabin. When night came again, I locked the door and pushed the table against it just in case. I turned off the lights and sat by the window, looking out into the darkness. The forest looked completely still, but every few minutes I'd think I saw something. A faint movement between the trees, a flicker of light, or a shape that wasn't there before. The fear wasn't sudden or sharp. It built slowly, like cold water rising around me. I must have fallen asleep near the window because I woke up to a faint sound again, this time from behind the cabin. It was that same dragging noise, but slower, heavier. I crept quietly to the back window. The glass was fogged, but I could see the faint outline of something, a dark shape moving near the edge of the woods. It was crouched, dragging something long behind it. The moonlight barely touched it, and I couldn't make out what it was carrying. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then it stopped moving. It just stood there, still and quiet. I backed away from the window, breathing slowly. I didn't know what to do. I had no signal, no weapon, no car close enough to reach without going outside. I waited for what felt like hours. When I finally looked again, the shape was gone. Morning came gray and cold. I checked the ground again. The marks behind the cabin were clear, a long drag line through the mud leading deep into the trees. I didn't follow it this time. I packed my bag and decided I'd leave that day, even if it meant driving back before dark. When I reached my car, I froze. The back door was slightly open and the inside was a mess. The seats torn, my spare clothes scattered everywhere. The glove compartment was open, and my small pocket knife was missing. I didn't even look around. I just got in, started the engine, and drove. The road was quiet all the way down, but I kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see someone walking out of the trees. I didn't stop until I reached the first gas station near the main road. When I finally stepped out, my hands were shaking. For a few minutes, I just stood there staring at my car, trying to calm down. The gas station attendant asked if I was okay, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. I drove straight back to the city that day. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound from outside made me jump. I kept thinking about that dragging noise, those footprints, the open car door. I called the rental company the next morning to report it. The man who answered sounded calm, almost too calm. He said there'd been some incidents around that area lately. People breaking into empty cabins, stealing supplies, or hiding out in abandoned places. He said one of their workers found a burnt campsite a few miles from the trail. Clothes, empty cans, and a few personal things left behind. No one knew who it belonged to. The forest rangers had searched but didn't find anyone. That night I sat by my apartment window looking out at the city lights. It should have felt safe, but it didn't. I couldn't shake the thought that whoever had been in those woods wasn't just passing through. The dragging sound, the footprints, the missing knife. It all fit too neatly. I thought about how remote that cabin was, how easy it would be for someone to live out there unseen for months. No one would notice. No one would hear anything. Maybe that dragging noise wasn't an object at all. Maybe it was something they carried, something they'd done before. I never went back to that area. It was already late when I reached the edge of the forest. The road was narrow and cracked, swallowed by the kind of darkness that headlights couldn't cut through completely. My GPS had stopped working miles back, the signal fading the deeper I went into the woods. The only sound was the hum of my truck's engine and the faint thud of tires over uneven dirt. I remember thinking how quiet it all was. Too quiet, like the world had shut itself off. I was heading to a small cabin I'd rented online. The pictures made it look cozy, a good place to get away for a few days, write, and clear my head. It was supposed to be simple, just me, some food, and time alone. But as I drove deeper into that forest, I started noticing how the trees seemed to grow denser, bending inward like they were trying to block the road. My phone had died hours earlier, and I couldn't tell if I was still going the right way. The dirt track looked barely used, and I hadn't seen another vehicle since I'd left the highway. When I finally spotted the cabin, it sat a bit off the road, half hidden behind a slope and a wall of tall pines. Its roof was slanted and dark, with a single rusted chimney sticking out like a crooked finger. The porch was covered in a thin layer of leaves, and one of the steps sagged when I stepped on it. The place smelled like damp wood and old smoke. Inside it was small but had everything I needed. A wooden table, a narrow bed, a stove, and a small window facing the forest. The air inside was stale, like no one had been there in months. Dust covered the shelves, and the single bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered weakly before staying on. I dropped my bag by the door and stood there for a minute just listening. There were no forest sounds. No crickets. No wind through the trees. Just silence. I tried to brush it off. After driving for hours, maybe my ears were still ringing from the road noise. I unpacked a few things, lit the small stove, and heated up a can of soup. The metal hissed as it warmed, the smell of cheap broth filling the cabin. Outside the window, the forest looked endless. The trunk stood still and black, and the moonlight barely touched the ground. That first night, I couldn't sleep. The bed creaked every time I moved, and the air felt heavy. Around midnight, I heard something faint, like soft crunching outside. At first, I thought it was an animal. Probably a deer, maybe even a raccoon. But then it stopped completely. I waited, staring at the ceiling, the sound of my own breathing loud in the silence. After a few minutes, it started again. Slow, deliberate crunches on gravel. I could tell it wasn't close to the cabin, but not far either. The sound came and went for nearly half an hour. When it stopped, I lay there awake for the rest of the night, too alert to sleep. The next morning, everything looked normal. I walked outside, the air crisp and cold. There were footprints in the dirt just beyond the porch steps. I leaned down to look closer. They weren't animal tracks. They looked like boot prints, heavy, deep, and pointed toward the trees. I scanned the forest, but it was still, like nothing had moved there for years. My stomach tightened. I told myself maybe they were old. Maybe someone else had been here before me. Still, the ground was damp from last night's rain. Those prints couldn't have been more than a few hours old. I spent most of the day inside, reading and trying to distract myself. Around noon, I took a short walk down the trail behind the cabin. The path led to a stream, quiet and cold, the water barely moving. The forest here felt strange, like everything was too dense. I could hear branches cracking somewhere far off, but never saw what caused it. By evening, I was jumpy. Every creak of the cabin made me look up. The light bulb buzzed softly overhead. The sun went down fast, and soon I was sitting by the stove again, staring into the small flame. That night, the noises came back. This time closer. I could hear steps moving slowly around the cabin, crunching leaves, snapping twigs. Whoever or whatever it was didn't rush. It moved like it knew I was listening. I didn't move from the bed. I just lay there, eyes wide open, breathing shallow. The steps stopped near the back wall. I waited, counting seconds in my head. Then there was a faint sound, like fingers brushing against the wood. Slow dragging touches along the cabin's side. The next morning, I walked the perimeter. There were marks on the wall. Long, thin scrapes like someone had run a stick or knife along it. The boot prints were back, this time circling the cabin. I thought about leaving, but the nearest gas station was miles away. I didn't even know if my truck would make it on that muddy road. I decided to stay one more night and leave early in the morning. The third night was worse. The air felt different, colder, like the temperature had dropped fast. I kept the stove burning, but the heat didn't seem to spread. The steps came earlier this time, just after dark. They moved from one side of the cabin to the other. Then they stopped completely. I waited, not even blinking. Then I heard the porch creak. Something was on it. The sound of slow weight pressing on wood. One step, then another. Then silence. I stared at the door, my chest tightening. I could see the faint shadow of movement under the door crack, like someone was standing just inches away. After a few minutes, the boards creaked again, this time fading away. I didn't sleep. When the first light came through the window, I packed everything fast and went outside. The porch had a wet spot, darker than the rest, like someone had been standing there for a long time. There were boot prints leading down the trail. I got in my truck and drove. The road looked worse in daylight, muddy, rutted, lined with trees leaning inward. I didn't stop, not once. When I finally saw the open road, I felt something in me loosen, like I'd been holding my breath for days. At a gas station a few towns away, I asked the clerk if he knew the cabin. He looked at me like I'd mentioned a place that shouldn't exist. He said there hadn't been anyone living out that way for years, not since a hiker went missing in those woods. They'd found his truck, but never him. I didn't say anything. I filled up my tank, got back in the truck, and drove until the forest was a memory in the rearview mirror. Weeks later, when I finally checked my camera, the one I'd left on the table inside the cabin, I found a photo I didn't remember taking. It was blurry, shot in low light. The frame showed the cabin door just barely open, and in the corner of the picture there was a shape. Tall, human, standing halfway out of sight. That was the last time I ever stayed in a cabin, even now. Sometimes when I'm driving at night through quiet roads, I catch myself glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see a figure standing there. Still, watching, waiting for me to stop again. It was late September when I decided to drive out to the old cabin my uncle left behind years ago. He used to hunt there every winter until he got too sick to go. I'd only been there once as a kid, but I still remembered the long dirt road that wound through endless trees, the smell of pine thick in the air, and how the forest seemed to swallow every bit of light once the sun went down. I'd been working long hours in the city, barely sleeping, barely eating, feeling like I was running on fumes. The cabin felt like the only place I could clear my head, quiet, away from everything. That's what I told myself anyway. The road started as a smooth stretch of asphalt but turned to gravel, then to packed dirt. Every few miles the forest grew thicker, pressing closer to the sides of the truck like it wanted to pull me in. My phone lost signal about 40 minutes in. After another half hour I reached the clearing. The cabin sat alone, hunched in the middle of tall grass and thin birch trees, its roof dark with moss and corners eaten by time. The air smelled damp, heavy, like rain was coming. The silence out there was strange, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Inside it was colder than outside. The wooden floor creaked under my boots, the air stale and sharp with dust. There were still old hunting trophies on the walls, a deer head, a few antlers, yellowed maps pinned beside them. The table in the corner was still set with old metal cups, a rusted lantern, and a half-broken radio. I dropped my bag near the bed, the mattress sagging in the middle. The sheets were still there, stiff with age. The place hadn't changed much at all. I spent the first few hours sweeping dust off the shelves, clearing out cobwebs, trying to make it feel livable. The quiet was strange. No cars, no voices, not even birds for a while. Just the occasional snap of a branch outside, the whisper of wind through the trees. By late evening, clouds had gathered overhead and the sky turned gray. The forest started to darken, slowly swallowing the last bit of daylight. I started a small fire in the stove, made some canned soup, and sat by the window eating while watching the trees move in the wind. That's when I noticed something odd. There was a faint path behind the cabin I hadn't seen before, half covered by fallen leaves and weeds. It wasn't on the old map nailed to the wall either. It led downhill into thicker woods where the light barely reached. It looked like no one had walked it in years. I figured maybe my uncle had used it once, or maybe it was a game trail. I told myself I'd check it out in the morning, though I already felt uneasy about it. The rain started late that night. Slow at first, then harder, hitting the roof like a drum. The wind rattled the windows and pushed smoke back into the room from the old stove. I turned off the lantern and lay in bed listening to the rain. The wood creaked every now and then, expanding and settling. I tried to sleep, but something about the noise outside kept me awake. The storm made the forest sound alive, branches bending, leaves slapping against the windows, something shifting through the wet grass outside. At one point, around 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard a deep thud near the back wall. Not like a branch falling, heavier, slower. Then nothing, just rain. My heartbeat picked up. I stayed still, listening. After a few minutes, another sound, like a dragging scrape, faint, moving along the side of the cabin. I sat up, staring toward the dark corner of the room, waiting for it again. The noise stopped. I told myself it was the storm. Maybe a fallen branch sliding off the roof, maybe an animal trying to get out of the rain. I forced myself to lie back down. Eventually, I drifted off. The next morning was foggy and still. Everything outside was soaked, the ground slick with mud. The air smelled like wet pine and earth. I went around the cabin to check for damage. On the far side, near the back window, the mud was disturbed, not just by rain, but by footprints. Bare footprints, small human-looking. They led toward the path I'd seen last evening. I crouched to get a closer look, touching the mud with my fingers. They were fresh. The rain had stopped maybe a few hours ago, but the edges of the prints were sharp, not washed out. I felt something tighten in my chest. I stood there for a long time, just staring at the trail. It disappeared quickly into the trees. I thought about following it, but decided to wait until later. I didn't like the idea of wandering into the woods alone while the ground was slick and visibility low. I told myself maybe some local kids had found their way here, or someone was camping nearby. Still, I kept checking behind me as I gathered some wood for the fire. By noon, the fog lifted and the forest turned calm again. I packed a flashlight, a pocket knife, and a bottle of water, then walked toward the path. The air got colder the deeper I went. The ground was uneven, roots sticking out like ropes, the silence thick. After maybe 10 minutes of walking, I found something that stopped me. A piece of torn fabric stuck on a branch, faded red, maybe from a shirt. A few steps later, another print in the mud, this time larger, deeper. Not bare, it looked like a boot. The path wound down toward a small stream. The water was murky from the rain. Across it I saw what looked like an old structure, maybe another cabin or shed hidden behind the trees. The roof had collapsed and moss covered the sides. I crossed the stream, slipping once on the rocks. The structure looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The door hung half off its hinges, and the smell coming from inside was sharp and sour, like rot. Inside were the remains of what looked like old hunting gear, broken traps, rusted cans, torn blankets. In the corner there was something that made my stomach twist. A pile of bones, small ones scattered beside an old shovel. Animal bones maybe, I hoped they were. But they were arranged strangely, like someone had stacked them intentionally. I backed out slowly, every sound suddenly louder. My breathing, the crunch of leaves, the distant creak of trees in the wind. I felt like I was being watched. I started back up the trail faster than I came, glancing behind me every few seconds. The forest seemed darker now, heavier. By the time I reached the cabin again, the light was already fading. I locked the door and pushed a chair under the handle, even though I knew it wouldn't do much if someone really wanted to get in. I sat by the window watching the tree line, every rustle of leaves making my nerves tighten. Night came quick, and with it the rain again, softer this time but steady. I lit the lantern and its glow barely reached the walls. Around midnight I heard footsteps again. Slow, careful, circling the cabin. My chest tightened so hard it hurt. I didn't move. The sound stopped, then started again near the back window. That same dragging sound from the night before. I reached for the knife on the table, my hand shaking. Then silence. Long, empty silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. When daylight came, I went outside again. The footprints were there, 2 sets this time. One bare, one with boots. They led away toward the woods but stopped halfway down the path like whoever it was had stood there watching. I thought about leaving right then, packing my stuff and driving out. But part of me, maybe pride, maybe stupidity, wanted to understand who or what was out there. I told myself I'd stay one more night. I spent most of that day chopping wood, keeping myself busy, anything to avoid thinking too much. But I couldn't stop checking the tree line. The forest felt different, quieter, heavier. Around evening I noticed something new. A smell in the air, faint but clear. Like smoke but not from my fire. It came from the direction of the old path. I followed it a short way, careful to stay quiet. The smell grew stronger, a burning wood, maybe something else mixed in. Through the trees I saw a flicker of orange light. I crouched low, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. The light came from a small fire near the old shed. And beside it, someone was sitting. A figure hunched forward, motionless. I couldn't make out details from that distance, just the outline. I didn't move. I just watched. The figure stayed there, staring into the fire. Minutes passed. Then slowly, their head turned toward me. I froze. Even from that distance, I knew they'd seen me. They stood up slowly, their movements stiff. I turned and walked back, trying not to run. But I could hear them, faint steps following, matching mine. When I reached the clearing near my cabin, I looked back. Nothing. The woods were still. That night, I didn't light a fire. I sat in the dark, listening. Hours passed, and then the sound came again, faint, steady, moving around the cabin. A scrape against the wall. A soft thud near the door. I gripped the knife tighter, my hands slick with sweat. Then silence again. It went on like that until dawn. When the first light hit, I opened the door. The footprints were there again, leading to the window this time, closer than before. The mud showed where someone had stood for a long time, just outside watching. That was it for me. I packed everything, didn't even bother to clean up. As I started the truck, I looked at the tree line one last time. The forest looked the same, quiet still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was standing just out of sight, watching me go. I didn't stop driving until I reached the main road, my hands locked tight on the wheel. Later, when I told the local sheriff about it, he said there hadn't been anyone living out there in years. The nearest house was miles away. He mentioned some hikers had gone missing near that area a few times over the years, but no one ever found anything. I didn't say much, just nodded and left. I never went back.